Let's talk Merrimack. I'm your host for today, Jen McInnes. A little bit about myself. My husband and I moved to Merrimack shortly after getting married, and we keep pretty busy with 2 cats, a dog, 3 snakes, and a backyard full of chickens, along with our 2 boys. The goal of this show is to talk about things that concern Merrimack residents and encourage you to get involved in the town. Today's show focuses on the congressional election that's coming up. Today I'm joined by Stefany Shaheen, one of the congressional candidates for the CD1 seat. Stefany, could you introduce yourself and your motivation for running for Congress?
Good morning, Jen. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for letting me be one of the very first guests. I'm excited to be here in Merrimack today. I'm Stefany Shaheen and got into this race about 4 months ago in the race for the 1st Congressional District to replace the seat being vacated by Chris Pappas. And my primary motivation initially was the appointment of Bobby Kennedy Jr. to become the Secretary of Health and Human Services, because I feel so strongly about what's happening to healthcare in this country. And I think putting someone in charge of the agency that's most responsible for the health and well-being of American citizens, who actually doesn't believe in science and doesn't want to make the investments we need to make healthcare more accessible to people, is something we have to stand up and fight against. And so as a mom of a child who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 8 years old, I've had to work very closely with a broken healthcare system that isn't really doing what we need the healthcare system to do in order to make sure people can afford, can access, and can be assured that if they have any kind of health crisis, they have the care they need and that they can stay healthy. So that was my primary motivation. And it's been now, as I said, a little over 4 months, and the best part has been getting to be across the district, reaching out to people, connecting and hearing what concerns folks have in towns like Merrimack. This is, I think, my 4th time in Merrimack since we've been on the campaign trail now.
Yeah. Great, thank you. You've already started talking a little bit about this, but can you talk about experiences or qualifications that you would like to bring to Congress?
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in this district. I grew up in Madbury. I graduated from Oyster River High School. I was a public school kid from K through 12. And have my whole life been working in this district on issues ranging from childcare to housing, and ran and built a small business here. I also served locally as a city councilor in Portsmouth, where we raised our family. My husband Craig and I raised 4 kids there. We're empty nesters for the first time now this month. All of our kids are now out of the house or in school, which feels very different. But having been on the city council and then also as chair of the police commission, I can appreciate firsthand how important local governing is and what a difference it makes when you work together with your neighbors to solve real problems for real people. And I think we got to get back to having government work that way at all levels, whether it's federal, state, or local.
Absolutely. This question is about the division in the country. How would you approach bringing Americans and Granite Staters back together from either side of the aisle?
I think that's one of the most important questions of our time, to be honest, relative to what we're seeing in the country and the division that's really plagued all of us in the last many years and months. I really believe local governing is a model that can help address those divisions. If you think about what it takes to serve locally on town councils, on city councils, on boards of aldermen, you often don't run as a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. You run as a concerned community member, and you run because you want to solve problems or issues challenging your community. And then you work alongside your neighbors in a way that ensures a degree of transparency and accountability, because when a pothole doesn't get filled or a school budget can't get passed or teachers are risking the loss of jobs, everyone in the community can see that and they can stand up and speak out against it. And I actually think that model of getting back to neighbor, person to person, community to community governing is what's going to help get our country on track.
Fantastic. That divisiveness has not been limited just to within the country, but also among our allied nations. Can you speak to what you might change or what changes you might like to see with our foreign policy?
Sure. Well, I think we have to start with the tariffs, because often we think about tariffs as an issue impacting small businesses and a domestic issue. But the fact is, in a state like New Hampshire, Canada is our #1 trading partner. So we've seen the ramifications of the relations right now between Canada and the US and how that's impacting local economies here. When tourists decide they're not going to come to Motorcycle Weekend because they don't want to be in the US from Canada, I heard firsthand we had 100,000 fewer people during Motorcycle Week in Laconia. Wow. Because of that. You hear from hospitality businesses that were impacted by having fewer people visit the state in the summer. So those are the kinds of policies I think we need to roll back. We have to eliminate the tariffs. We have to foster positive relationships that benefit our partners and our country. And I think Canada is a perfect example. I talked to a small business owner recently who relies on raw materials from Canada, and is struggling to figure out how to price their products now, and struggling to know when they're going to be able to access these materials because of the tariffs. So I would say, even though we think about it on the ground here as a domestic issue, it really is a foreign policy issue also, given how these tariffs are being implemented. I also think we need to stick very closely to supporting what's happening in Ukraine and ensure that the Ukrainians have what they need to respond to Russia's attacks. I don't believe Putin's going to stop with Ukraine, and I think the bravery and commitment the Ukrainians have demonstrated to protecting their homeland needs to be supported, and we need to continue to do that.
Thank you. One of the major issues for residents of Merrimack is cost of living. We're especially seeing that in the increase in property taxes. What role do you see the federal government having in bringing financial relief to our families, seniors, and young people in town?
Well, I think that's one of the most compelling and important questions locally for all of us to be wrestling through and helping people connect the dots about. And actually, I heard firsthand in Merrimack when I was here last about how the effects of the rising healthcare costs are going to impact property taxes here. And if you think about the federal budget that just passed, when we cut Medicaid and we cut food assistance, that directly impacts property taxpayers in this state because we fund our state budget, which is required to be a balanced budget, with property tax revenues. So when the state isn't getting federal support for things like Medicaid, that puts an increased burden on the state to cover those expenses, and that drives up property taxes. And as a city councilor, I saw this firsthand because often, taxpayers are getting their tax bill from the city or town where they live. And so it's hard, I think, for people to always make the connection between my property taxes are going up, and that's a function of increased costs that are being shifted from the federal and state governments down to local cities and towns. It's a downshifting that's only getting worse and getting harder. And this isn't sustainable. We already have a very severe housing crisis in this state. It's only getting worse. And as we see rising property taxes make it more and more affordable, we're going to have a harder time keeping young people here because if you can't afford housing and you can't afford childcare and the wages you can earn are only so high, you can't make a life in New Hampshire. And I think we have to do everything in our power to make sure cities and towns have the resources they need to govern and to manage the priorities at the local level, and not expect that we're going to shift these costs that aren't being covered by the federal government and the state government down to cities and towns.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to that, when you talk to voters, do you get the sense that they're aware of how the federal choices are becoming a property tax issue? That feels so disconnected to me.
It is hard for people, I think, sometimes, but in general, what I hear from voters is a real angst and concern about affordability overall. And I do think they make the connection, obviously everybody's different, but people understand that when you cut programs, benefits, and services at the federal level, it's driving up costs. Yeah. People understand that the tariffs are responsible for increasing the price of the coffee they get at Dunkin' Donuts in the morning. They understand that healthcare costs are just going to continue to go up. We saw a statistic from the month of July in New Hampshire that the price for fresh fruits and vegetables in New Hampshire in the month of July went up by almost 40%. It was the single largest increase in 1 month since 1947. And it's a combination of the tariffs and the fact that we have farms that aren't able to be as productive because they don't have the workforce they need. And people feel that. When you go to the grocery store and your dollars aren't going as far and your cart isn't as full, that you see that. When it's harder to make your rent payment or you can't find an affordable apartment, people are feeling that directly. And I think it's our job during this campaign and, as local leaders and community members to help connect the dots, that when you cut Medicaid and that impacts your local community health center or your local rural hospital or drives up your health insurance costs, that's correlating with an increase in property taxes.
Absolutely. To switch gears a little bit, PFAS exposure is a concern, especially amongst Merrimack residents. We're very familiar with that. What history do you have with the issue? And do you think there's something at the federal level that you can do to tackle this issue?
Absolutely. I think it's one of the most important environmental concerns of our time, frankly. The need to ensure clean and safe drinking water in communities across New Hampshire and across the country is a priority that can't be overstated. It's one that shaped my experience on the City Council. When I was on the City Council, PFAS contamination was discovered in the largest aquifer in the city. We had to close the aquifer, and we were able to correlate the contamination with training that had happened at Pease Air Force Base with firefighting foam and retardant that was used to put out fires. And thankfully, because we knew the source and it was unequivocal that it was the Air Force that had contaminated the aquifer, we had somebody in the form of the military, the Air Force, that was responsible for the cleanup. But because it happened at the Pease Trade Port, Child Care Center had been using the water for years and had unknowingly exposed kids that were in the care of that facility to PFAS. And so we worked really hard during our tenure on the City Council to ensure that everybody who had been exposed was able to be screened so they could see what levels of these chemicals they had in their bloodstream and to target over time to ensure those levels were going down. Mm-hmm. We were able to work with the healthcare community in the Seacoast region to make sure that doctors that were treating families that had been exposed had the best research and information they could possibly have. We were able to get folks enrolled in a study to study over time the effects of PFAS in people's bodies. So, to me, the most critical thing we can do is inform and educate and make sure this kind of contamination doesn't continue. In a community like Merrimack, there's also a real concern about groundwater contamination in people's wells, and how do we test for that? How do we make sure individual homeowners have the tools they need to have their water tested if they're not on a city system like what happened in Portsmouth? And in Portsmouth, we had, surrounding Newington and surrounding neighborhoods that were impacted and needed to have well testing available to them too. So at the federal level, I think there's several things we need to do. We need to restore the EPA limits for PFAS levels in water, what we're willing to tolerate, and be testing for those. I think we need to ensure that there's funding available for cleanup because in a community like Merrimack, the property taxpayer can't absorb the total cost of the cleanup, and yet it has to be cleaned up. So I think we need to address funding for how that cleanup occurs. And then I think we need to make sure that organizations like ATSDR, which did the study of the folks that were exposed to PFAS, can have the resources they need to continue to study the effects of PFAS in people so that we have credible science that shows that these forever chemicals are dangerous. And then finally, because I think it affects communities across the country, firefighters are disproportionately exposed to PFAS because of the materials they have to use. And I think we need to make sure we understand the risks we're asking firefighters to assume by doing the jobs they're doing. And so I think we need a study to look at the exposure of PFAS in the profession of firefighting.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something I hadn't considered before and seems really important and almost obvious now that you say it out loud. To switch gears a little bit,
Yes.
let's do a lightning round.
Fun.
A few fun questions
Great.
to help voters get to know you a little better.
Yes.
So, very relevant to Merrimack. Hard or soft ice cream?
Hard.
Okay. Okay.
Although I do love a soft serve dipped in hard chocolate. You know that I think that
absolutely.
in my place they call it dip. So I do love the soft serve with chocolate dip.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Do you have a favorite sport?
Yes, I grew up playing volleyball and basketball. When I was really little, I also played soccer and played Little League. Okay. But I played volleyball all the way through college and got a scholarship to play in college. And I've coached volleyball at the high school level at Portsmouth High School. So I have to say volleyball. But I do love all sports.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you go to the ocean or a lake?
Ocean. My husband grew up on Winnipesaukee, though, so I have also developed an affinity for the lake because of his favorite childhood memories. And the thing about the lake, which you don't get from the ocean, is that you can enjoy it all year round. I mean, he has stories of ice fishing and ice hockey and snowmobiling on the lake. Mm-hmm. And I grew up on the seacoast, so it was ocean, but you don't get to enjoy it in the same way in the winter necessarily.
Absolutely. Italian or Mexican food?
Oh, that's a toss-up. It kind of depends on my mood, but I love both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard one to pick between.
Yes.
Apples or oranges?
Apples.
Apples. It's a good season for that.
Yes.
We were just apple picking the other day.
Yes, and so I have funny apple stories. So I grew up down the street from an apple orchard in Madbury, and my dad had planted a few trees when I was a kid in our backyard. And it takes a while for apple trees to bear fruit. Mm-hmm. And the first year the apple trees bore fruit, I was so excited that I picked all the apples off the tree before they were actually ripe.
Oh, no.
And I thought I was going to have my own little lemonade stand at the end of the driveway selling my apples. Now, mind you, we grew up on a rural road where there wasn't a lot of car traffic, but I was convinced I could sell these apples. I must have been 8 or 9. And when my dad drove into the driveway and saw that I'd picked all the apples off the trees before they were ripe, he said to me, "So this is a life lesson." He said, "If you're lucky in life, you will learn lessons from other people's mistakes. Today you were not so lucky. You had to make the mistakes on your own." But yes, and I grew, always, my best friend lived next to a very large apple orchard, Roseland Farm, and always got to, run around in the orchard and eat the apples off the trees. So
that's the best.
Apples.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs. Although I love my cat growing up with Snuggles, but my husband and my son are both allergic to cats. Okay. So in my adult life, we've
become dog people.
Yes, yeah.
Yep, understood.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this has been a very short conversation, and you doubtless have much more to say. So what would you like to close out on, and how can voters learn more?
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I am so grateful for the opportunity to come to Merrimack and have these important conversations. And I want folks to know that this is the start of a campaign. The primary isn't being held until a year from this month. Mm-hmm. So we've got a long way to go. I hope to be back here many, many more times. And I want to find as many ways to engage and be connected and in conversation with people as possible over the next year. So I would invite your viewers to reach out to us and share opportunities for us to come back and to be engaged in conversation, whether it's a book club or a coffee shop or a party in someone's backyard. We'd love to be back as often as possible. People can find us on our website, which is at stephanyshaheen.com. And ultimately, I think, for a community like Merrimack, you really personify the best of New Hampshire and the challenges we face moving forward. It's one of the fastest growing communities in the state. And I think that, we got to solve problems for families here, and they're indicative of the same challenges people are facing across the district. And I'm certain we can do it together. So.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Jen.
And that wraps us up for today. So thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to our next conversation, Merrimack.